Before you were a pastor, do you have any memory of church services you attended after a big cultural event?
Yeah, I remember attending church the Sunday after 9/11. Most of the people listening to this probably have some recollection of that, but that was a big moment. And what I really remember was we were preaching through the Gospel of Luke, the pastor was, and we got to the part where a tower had fallen on people. And I thought, oh man, is he going to preach about this? And he didn't. He did a different message. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember that sense that everybody was there eager to hear what was going to be said.
There's two moments that I remember. The first one was right after Katrina, when all of these displaced people were making their way across the United States because they couldn't, hundreds of thousands of people, I think it was, couldn't stay there. Our church, all the way in Arizona, far away from New Orleans, took in 3 or 4 families, about 20 people. And I remember them being there. And then the other one was after one of the tsunamis. I forget which year it was. It was off of the coast of Japan. After that happened, that night we gathered at the church to talk and to pray and to process through it. So those are the two that I remember. Hey, welcome to the Preaching Through podcast. My name is Dave Shrine, and this is still co-host, and still Luke Simmons.
Hey, good to see you, buddy.
Always in forever.
Oh, yeah, this is fun.
This is a lot of fun. Today's conversation, we started off a little bit somber, not necessarily that the whole conversation needs to be somber, but the idea of processing through big cultural events, and a lot of those big cultural events tend to be of a more traumatic or more less than ideal. How would you characterize? You get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, at kind of the most trivial, their controversy.
Yeah. And
then often their tragedy. So there is a soberness to it. Hopefully it doesn't have to be somber, but it needs to be sober. And my hope is that this conversation can really help some pastors and preachers figure out how to address these things, because there's a lot of pressure to say something or not say something, and you can fall off the horse in a lot of different directions.
In the position that you find yourself in, whether as a senior pastor, associate, student, whatever the case might be, there is an expectation that you will have a thought, or you will have an opinion, or you will have, at the very least, something to say. And so the idea behind this episode is maybe looking at some of the things that have happened in the past and how those have been handled, and how to prepare to handle different things as they inevitably come up in the future. And I think there's a couple ways that the conversation can happen. I think there is the singular events, and then how the church might handle it the day after. For instance, if something were to come down and there were news on a Monday, how would the church handle it all the way until that coming up Sunday? Whereas if something happened on a Saturday, how would the church handle it maybe on a Sunday? So there's the singular event and the days that follow. And then there are ongoing cultural events, ongoing controversies, headlines. So there's different levels that this conversation is happening on.
The volume and the temperature on these things just feels like so high. And so I think that's where we need a lot of wisdom to try to figure out, what do we do with this? How does this relate to our pastoral leadership in general, but our preaching in particular?
In one of our previous episodes, we talked about preaching through the Gospels. And one of the points that was made is just, we don't want to put something in the mouth of Jesus. We don't want to put an emotion on Jesus, or have Jesus take a tone in the way we present the gospel or preach the word that maybe he didn't have. And so there was a lot of reflection that you'd walked us through in terms of taking in the entire scene and then preaching the word as a result of that. Do you feel like there's an element of that in terms of giving a biblical response to maybe something God didn't speak super clearly on? He didn't say you should or should not do this, yet the Bible clearly has something to say about the bigger idea.
Yeah, the Bible talks all the time about pain and about tragedy and about what to happen, how to approach calamity, how to approach times when it seems like God allowed something that was unfair. So the Bible has lots to say there, lots of principles, lots of wisdom. I think we got to be really careful about drawing real straight lines. I remember after 9/11, for example, there were lots of people proclaiming how this was God's judgment on America because of blah, blah, blah. And that happened. There's always, some fundamentalist somewhere that wants to make that kind of connection. And that just feels a little too clean. God is probably doing 10,000 different things in anything that he allows to have happen. And I don't quite have the decoder ring that tells me exactly what it is. So in these moments, we want to go to the big picture principles. We want to go to the heart. As much as anything, too, I think, and this would be a good example, even when I thought earlier about, the church I was attending when I was in college during 9/11, people rarely will remember what you said, but they'll remember how it felt. And they'll remember how you felt as you processed it. And it's actually that's going to lead them more than the specific words you say. Obviously, if you say the wrong words, they'll remember that. And that can be really damaging if you are flippant or if you are cruel or something like that. But you can say the perfect words, and it doesn't matter as much as actually your presence.
One of the other angles that maybe I will help steer the conversation towards is to remember that not only is there the cultural event that we're talking about, not only are there the facts or the feelings that evolve from that, but the people who make up the church, the experiences that they bring into that, and the personality traits that they bring into that. And the reason why I want to be mindful of that is because I remember going to church on that Tuesday night to pray for the victims of the tsunami. I remember, and I'm comfortable saying this, I remember feeling like that's a world away. Like, I don't feel emotional about this. I don't feel as maybe compassionate as I should feel, or maybe I just didn't project the type of compassion other people felt, yet I felt it inside in a different way, and I was trying to capture something. So there's all sorts of people who are processing in their own unique ways, and just because one shows emotion one way and another shows an emotion a different way, it doesn't mean that one's valid or invalid. It just highlights that there is a very delicate balance to navigating all types of situations similar to this. And that really, in the end, I think one of the things that I've seen from our church and one of the things I've seen in my own life is making those decisions on how to approach it in isolation almost certainly tends to end up with some, let's just say, ways you wish you would have done it differently.
Yeah. There's definitely some do-overs you want if you just try to do it by yourself. You're right, Dave. I mean, it is absolutely true that people are coming at these things with different experiences, and so many of them happen that it is hard to feel the kind of compassion and sensitivity that maybe we should want to have. But also, to your point, just people's different perspective. I mean, there are news events based on people's news sources now, and how fragmented people's media consumption is, that people don't even know the same things that happened. I mean, you could have an event that someone in the church was going to go, how on earth could you not have talked about that? And someone else in the church is going to go, I didn't even know that happened. This part of kind of filtering this through and going, hey, how do you make these decisions? What do you decide to do? What do you decide not to do? What's a proportionate response? Those are all important things.
We'll get into that. So this is a great episode for this Preaching Through podcast, because ultimately what we want to do here is we want to rid you of the environment of planning and preaching in isolation. You should not feel like you have to carry everything all on your own. And I know that ministry sometimes very much feels like you are alone. And if my people would just, and if I could just get everyone to this idea of, then everything would come together. Well, you know what? The Spirit is doing all sorts of things that we'll never know, but we can do things to help better set ourselves up to, I don't know, steward the environments and steward the messages that we've been entrusted to. And so that's why we do this podcast.
For the guys that are alone and the people that are doing this alone, we just want to try to be a friend.
Yeah.
Hopefully not the only one, but hopefully a faithful one, that at least another voice to help people think through things.
And it's a great conversation to bring up this idea of preaching through big events, big cultural events. And our desire is that at the end of this episode, you'll have a little bit more perspective on how you can approach whatever happens next, whenever it happens next. Let's get into it. Great. Hey, pastors, let's think back to a time when you prepared your very first sermon. All you had in front of you was an assigned passage and a blinking cursor. You weren't sure how to start, so you began studying the passage and then writing whatever came to mind. You got through it, preached your sermon, but how much more effective would the entire process have been if you had started your preparation with a little bit more insight, a little bit more help? This is where Ministry Pass comes in. Ministry Pass sermon resources provide pastors with a head start on planning sermon series, as well as drafting their individual sermons, saving hours every week while still putting their best foot forward and preaching a sermon that's true to them. Instead of starting with a blank page and just searching for ideas, Ministry Pass offers ready-to-use sermon content that can fit into any sermon or serve as an inspirational springboard for other ideas. When you log in to ministrypass.com, you immediately gain access to over 1,500 sermon series. That's 75 years worth of sermon content. Each series comes with a series guide that includes suggested illustration ideas, series big ideas for your individual messages, possible application points, and even a sermon series graphic package. Head over to preachingthrough.com/ministrypass for a free trial and start writing faithful sermons faster. So to start off the entire conversation, it's probably worth just going back through and looking at some of the cultural events that might be reminiscent of what we could anticipate in the future. There are different levels, different layers, different time lapsing.
Things that if you were a pastor, you'd be going, okay, what do we do with this?
So I'll start with gas prices.
I thought you were talking about the past, Dave.
History just seems to repeat itself over and over again. So that's low-hanging fruit for all sorts of different commentary. Then one of the first ones in the recent decades was the Challenger explosion of 1986.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even as you think about this, I just think of Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire" song, and all the different things that are in that. It's like each one of those would be something that a preacher might be tempted to talk about.
If we had the copyrights, I'd just play it right now and then bypass it. But you got O.J. Simpson trial, which was not just 1995, but that's one of those that spanned over multiple years. Y2K,
right,
where we thought the world was going to come to an end. It didn't.
Sure. I wonder how many people preached end of the world sermons and went, oops.
Yeah. Whoops.
I don't know.
Famous last words. Of course, there was 9/11 mentioned at the beginning. You have the tsunamis, which I mentioned, and there were two major ones, 2004 and then 2011. Then you had Sandy Hook, which happened in 2012. And this was really, there had been events similar to that had happened in the past, but this one was of such a magnitude, as well as happening in the social media era. It's kind of a different.
Yeah, I think you had the combination of how many people were killed during that. You had the social media thing, and you had that it affected children. That felt kind of different. And that was actually one where in our church we paused and I did a special standalone message on that. It felt like that really needed it. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about is really how to discern whether it needs that. But Sandy Hook was one that I thought needed it.
Obviously, you fast forward then to COVID in 2020, and there's some other things that happened, but the next real large scale thing that impacted the world was COVID. And there are still parts of the world today that are not back to normal. So that's a reality that we're living in. And then several things that happened after that. Obviously, George Floyd. Then there was the 2020 election.
Yeah.
There was the transfer of power. There's
January 6th.
And there continues to be just a nonstop flood of news. It's this 24/7 news cycle. Some things feel like they're over in a blip. I mean, there was the Afghanistan, pulling out of Afghanistan, which seemed...
Yeah, it's funny. Even as you think about this whole timeline, you got the fall of the Berlin Wall. You've got the first Iraq War. You've got the second, the War on Terror. The withdrawal of Afghanistan. I mean, there's just lots and lots of world events. In 2022, it's been, Russia invading Ukraine. We've had a school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. I mean, it doesn't stop.
There's no shortage, and it's going to happen again. And we know that not because we're doomsdayers, but because we know this world is fallen. Yeah. We know that the enemy's time is set, but we don't know when that is. And so as pastors, as ministers, as believers, we have a unique responsibility, and that's what this episode is about, to say things that are true, maybe have wisdom in avoiding saying things that might be how we feel about it, but not necessarily communicate what Jesus has said about it, and then to just address the uniqueness of all of the individuals involved. And so...
Well, we did an episode earlier on how to preach through an election season.
Right.
And that to me is kind of the proactive. It's like, this is coming. You're preparing people for this. Here's a cultural difficult moment that's ahead. We see it. We're planning for it. What we're talking about in this episode is the stuff you didn't see coming. And now it's a question of, are you going to respond to it, or worse, are you going to react to it? And so that's maybe how this is a little bit different. They're in a similar vein of, they're both related to difficult, contentious cultural moments that are either painful because of what happened, or the responses to it, multiply the pain. But yeah, that's what this conversation really is okay, it's already happened. Now what?
You've given me 3 ways. The first thing that I want to talk about is just the very simple question of, how should the pastor approach the controversy? And you've given me 3 postures that really articulate the options that we've got. So why don't you go into that?
Yeah, there's 3 choices, really. I mean, this oversimplifies it, but you can take a real emotional posture, and depending on what it is, that might be appropriate. Emotional, I don't mean here necessarily is bad, but it's mostly kind of connecting with the emotional thing. You can take a more indifferent or analytical posture, which probably isn't always in touch with the moment, depending on what the pain of it is. People don't really need a pundit. They need a pastor. Another option is you can take the political or the partisan thing. And man, when I just think about how this whole thing happens now, I mean, that's one of the dynamics now, is anything that happens, there's a political partisan flavor to it quick. Like, yeah, I mean, the proverbial bodies are not even warm before, or not even cold before they start kind of going, okay, well, what about this for politics? And it's really distasteful. So yeah, I mean, of those 3, I guess I'd rather, have kind of the emotional kind of perspective, but I think what I really want to think of it as is more the shepherd, right? I'm not a political pundit. I'm not a cultural analyst, and I'm not just a therapist that helps you feel better about it. But we're called to be shepherds. We're called to kind of feed the flock, care for the people. And so I think that would be probably, if we have a 4th kind of perspective, that's the one I'd want to have.
It's very similar to that election episode where we talked about the 5 different animals that you could be during an election season. You could be a donkey. You could be an elephant. You could be an ostrich, just kind of put your head in the sand. You could be a giraffe and say, I'm kind of above all this, and this is all petty. Or you could be a lamb.
Yeah.
And which animal will you most identify with? I think these various postures that pastors might find themselves taking, emotional, indifferent, political, really shepherd is the one that your people need from you. The phrase you said, they don't need a pundit, they need a pastor.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great perspective. One of the things,
and I think it's important actually to say that when you're talking to your church about these things, is to say, you don't need me now to be a pundit. You need me to be a pastor, because everything's so politically charged that if you say something, people will take it as though you're just another talking head on cable news. And to actually say, I'm not being a pundit here. I'm not trying to give you my analysis here. I'm trying to shepherd and care for you and pastor you here. It helps people kind of go, oh, okay. They let their guard down.
So the question is, how should the pastor handle controversy? And then you've had a few experience, because you've been pastoring through several of these events.
Sure.
Most recently, the longest lasting one was COVID. But
right.
What has been your personal experience going through this type of cultural event?
Yeah, well, anytime there's a big cultural event, you have to decide, how are we going to handle it? And there's a number of different choices. So list that I made is, you can do nothing. That's one choice. And there's lots of things that happen in culture. There's lots of things that happen in the news. And that's kind of the default answer, really, is most of the time we do nothing, right? I don't want to be a kind of leader that is just constantly reacting to the news. I actually think you could grow a church that way. And some people are experimenting with that, but I don't think that's faithful ministry. So I don't want to be every week, here's the breaking news and here's my latest rant on whatever's going on. I don't think that's healthy. On the other hand, always doing nothing kind of buries your head in the sand like that ostrich. And I don't think that helps people all the time. But the default thing is we're going to do nothing. Most of the time, lots of news is happening. We aren't talking about it. But there's other things you could do in a service. You could pray about a particular thing. You could take a moment to lead a corporate prayer, to lead a moment of kind of silence and reflection and thought. So that's something you could do. Sometimes you could make sort of a heartfelt announcement. I mean, that doesn't quite seem right, but depending on what it is, again, people might not know exactly about it. So you might offer some particular insights there or reflections. Maybe it's something that you add a sermon point to, or you make part of an existing sermon point, that sort of a thing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you might even go as far, and I think this is the rare thing to do, hopefully, of canceling whatever you were scheduled to preach on and doing a special message about it. Another thing that's available now because of social media and lots of other things is you can also say, we recorded a podcast about this. You could tell people on a Sunday, hey, we've sat down and we've had a longer form conversation about how to process this. This was something that at our church we did recently after a shooting. And you could do that. You could, record a video. I mean, there's just lots of different ways you could process things. But I think what you have to figure out is, like, does it match and does it feel right? And some of what was so difficult in COVID and in all the cultural moments that were happening throughout COVID was you only could address it through distance. And when people can't look you in the eye and can't be there in the room with you and can't feel the way you're feeling about it, and the distance multiplied the challenges of communicating and leading through those moments. But yeah, those are some things that we have to decide, because you don't want to be reactionary and you don't want to be aloof.
So you've got how the pastor responds. The next thing that pastors have to go through is, how does the church respond? And you touched on that briefly by saying, maybe you mentioned it in your service, maybe it's a big enough deal that you cancel what you were planning on doing and you do a different message instead. In the instance of COVID, you were forced.
Sure.
The church was forced to have a response. So how should the church handle the controversy?
In my answer before, I'm assuming plurality and team. Even if you're the only paid staff pastor, you should have elders or deacons or a board or a team or key volunteers or your wife or somebody else.
Yeah.
And so that whole discernment of, should this be a prayer? Should this be a nothing? Should this be a this? That should all be happening with, the consultation of leaders. Because if you're going to speak to something, you all have to own it. I think that's one of the dangers too, is, I don't want to say something about a key cultural event or people's responses to it on behalf of the church leadership if I don't know what the church leadership thinks about it.
Right.
Like, that's a dangerous place to be. And then I think, to your examples earlier, depending on how close it is and what your capacity is, what the church does about these things might really vary. So you mentioned the hurricane. Well, that's something that's like, okay, here's an opportunity to send people to, do this. Depending on what it is, you may or may not have something that you can really even call people to other than to pray. But that would be something you would call people to.
One of the things I remember, and I'm not saying that we take a position one way or the other, but in Arizona, one of the big issues during Trump's presidency was the border and building a wall across the border. And that was something that continued to find its way into national news, but it was also on the local radar because we are a border state. We have Mexico just south of the border. We never addressed many of the national stories from the pulpit, but there was an instance where the message that you were preaching lined up, and I don't remember exactly how it came together, but it lined up with the border situation. And one of the things that I remember, it just was threaded so perfectly, was the idea of, correct me if I say any of this incorrect.
You got a good memory of stuff, Dave.
Yeah.
I'm drawing a blank so far, but maybe
So
you'll jog it loose.
You had said, look, here's the deal. We're not taking a position other than I have no influence over what happens here. All I know is we are called to love people. And here is what we do as a church and organizations we support, that we line up with their mission and their mission lines up with Scripture. You said, but that's not a decision that I have to make.
Yeah, if I worked for the Department of Homeland Security or for the Border Patrol or for some administration that was determining public policy, what I think about how the border situation ought to be handled matters.
Right.
Otherwise, what I think about it doesn't matter that much. It at least doesn't matter as much as loving my neighbor.
Right.
And so, that was that point of saying, okay, we have to prioritize certain things here. And we talked a lot about that in the episode about preaching through political stuff, is just the priority of love.
So being a single church with multiple congregations, each, the redemption model specifically, each church is autonomous in that it has its own budget, has its own staff.
Yeah, we're like a pretty tight-knit local network or denomination.
That being the case, there is still this connection between one another. And the churches are very diverse, not
Mhm.
just in geographic location, but also in socioeconomic, you might even say social ways. So how has the redemption model, how have you seen that handled differently from congregation to congregation?
Yeah, I mean, it's made these things harder, honestly, because like I think about the situation, particularly after George Floyd was murdered.
Hmm.
Some of our congregations are in, and again, this is really specific to our situation, but some of our congregations are very multi-ethnic, and if you were white, you'd be in the minority in that kind of congregation. Some of our congregations are heavily white majority, and so people's experience of those events was just wildly different as we tried to address those things, or as people would listen to what different pastors at different congregations would say, depending on the situation they were in, they thought, well, that pastor didn't say enough, or that
Uh-huh.
pastor said too much. And especially because people were home and it was COVID and you had all this time on your hands to nitpick what everyone said about everything. But yeah, that made that difficult. But that adds just a layer to what every church is dealing with, right? Every church has a diversity of ages and a diversity of backgrounds and a diversity of perspectives. And all of that is what has to be considered as you think about how to address these things. Even kind of a core question is, how big of a story is this
Hmm.
really? This breaking thing happens. How big of a story is it really? And how much does it affect our people really? And that's hard because, well, who's our people,
People.
right? That depends a lot how big your church is and how broad things are. And again, what might seem like, well, of course you're going to talk about this, to one person might feel like, I didn't even know about that, to another person.
That's one of the things that I've learned a lot being a part of the larger redemption, is little impact as I have from the other congregations and as little communication as I have with other congregations. That's one of the things that I've become hyper aware of, is that the way it impacts me is a lot different than the way that it's going to impact other people. And then in that, I've found comfort in what I mentioned at the very beginning, in that I don't get very emotional
Yeah.
about things. I don't, and even in, deaths in my life and things like this, I'm pretty consistent in my reactions and my responses. It's comforted me on one hand, knowing that everybody's different from me. And it's also challenged me on the other hand, of knowing that there's other people handling this through a different lens and through a different filter. A couple of the things you mentioned earlier, ways that you can handle this is, number one, you could stop the whole service and you
Hmm.
could just change gears. Another way is by offering a prayer. Another way is by lament. Talk a little bit about lament, because that's one of the things we've done recently
Hmm.
in our congregation.
Yeah. I heard somebody say that if you preach to people who are in pain, you will always have an audience.
Yeah.
And you mentioned on a previous episode about depression and the anxiety that people carry and the pain that's just in our lives. Something I've actually started doing is, on the top of my sermon notes every week, on after I print them out,
Hmm.
I'll write at the top, preach to sinners and sufferers.
Hmm.
And so that has informed our sense of saying, okay, the Bible's filled with lament. I think people have estimated somewhere around a third of the Psalms are lament Psalms, but a third of the time of our services don't feel like that.
Right.
And I don't know that they're supposed to exactly, but man, at least something somewhere. And so some of what we've tried to do is to have more regular times of lament that aren't necessarily about some big cultural moment. And actually, if you have these times of lament, then when the cultural moment happens, it's not like, oh man, they sure had a big reaction to that thing. Why'd they react to that and not to that? It's like,
Right.
well, this is part of our rhythm. This is part of what we do. And so sometimes those will be written prayers. Sometimes those will be kind of things where the church calls in response. Occasionally we've done it where it's a special music thing, a song that really wouldn't be a good sing along song. I think about Hillsong has a song called Even When It Hurts. It's not really a worship song, it's a lament song. And so we'll just sing that over people and have times of prayer. So that's what the lament has looked like for us.
I think even in the way we've talked back and forth is an illustration of, there is no clear cut way to handle any one type of event, much less a myriad of different events. The kingdom of God is just too diverse for that.
Yeah.
And the condition of the heart is just too wide ranging to say this is the way that you should handle it. But I do believe one of the things that we identified in our planning was the idea of proactive, reactive, and then preventative, restorative. And I think these are attitudes that we could take towards how we operate our ministries in general, so that we can line up with what you just said. No, this is more habitual for us. This is something that lines up with what we do regularly. We have a specific focus now. And I think that's where I'd like to start to round up this conversation and maybe give some more practical insights that pastors can take and apply to whatever might happen.
What we're talking about is that there's an ongoing preaching and leadership that prepares people to deal with pain in the world. Mm. And so we just have to have that in mind. If our preaching and our leadership is always only kind of about the heavenly by and by, it's not connecting to real life. And so that connecting to real life, being able to use an illustration here or there from something that's going on in the world without it feeling like, man, this guy just preaches the headlines. You're also creating the culture of the church. How do we respond to difficult things? What's our posture towards contentious stuff?
And that stuff matters. People pick up on that stuff.
Sure.
If you're intentional or unintentional, they pick up on it.
Yeah. And you set the temperature for how people are going to approach those things. And so that's the stuff you can do proactively. But again, the reactively is just the wisdom and the discernment that you need. So I made a list of just some questions that I intuitively and sometimes just formally will sort of ask our team as we go through this to try to figure out, okay, from a reactive standpoint, what should be our response? So one of them that we talked about is how big of a story is this? Another one is what else is happening in the service and how flexible is it? If it's baptism Sunday, you're going to have a heck of a time, at least the way we do baptisms, with testimonies and everything. You're going to have a hard time, reorienting everything. There's a question of what's the cost of addressing it in terms of people's trust. If you're someone who is just constantly getting on the latest cultural thing, that wears thin. Another question, what's the cost of not addressing it? Right? So you just see how these cut in all different directions. Another question is, how related is this to things we're dealing with as a church and a society? Our church, for example, is very committed to foster care and adoption, which is very related to issues related to pro-life. So as news breaks related to that, that's more relevant to us than maybe other kinds of cultural issues that happen. Even just, there's a woman in our church who has been a key person in our church for a long time who's from Ukraine. And so when the war in Ukraine hit, well, that hit close to home. We weren't going to ignore that because, she's in our church family. And then another question is, can we handle this in a way that's sensitive to the diversity of our congregation? We've talked about that. Another one is our potential response appropriate to the significance of the event? You don't want to overreact or underreact. So all these are just, again, this is wisdom. It's more art than science, but trying to figure out, okay, when does this warrant some public leadership? And I guess the thing that I would say too, after the last few years, is I think one of the things that I'm trying to avoid, but man, it's hard right now, if I'm just really honest, is I want to lead out of conviction and love and leadership and not out of fear. And even you can hear it in some of the conversation is like, what are we going to say? And how are people going to feel about it? And how are they going to react? And there's prudence and there's wisdom to consider that. You're a fool if you don't think about that. But if you avoid saying something because you're just afraid, that's dumb. And that lacks conviction. On the other hand, if you just need to make a point about everything and it isn't going to move the needle or care for your people, well, that's dumb too. But I think right now, pastors, we're like that abused puppy that gets adopted. And every time, the owner moves, the puppy flinches because it's just used to that kind of a thing. And that's a little bit how we are right now as pastors. And it's like, one more thing. I don't know. What are we going to do? I don't know. But I just want to personally, and then encouraging anyone who's listening, like, hey, let's lead with conviction and passion and clarity and try to avoid the fear.
Ultimately, we are meaning to become disciples of Jesus. We want to live like him. We want to feel like him.
Yeah.
We want to feel the emotions like he would feel the emotions. We want to react, respond. We want to be compassionate. We want to be like him. And there's such a tendency with the news cycle and the constant bombardment to be discipled by everything other than Jesus. And so one thing that has been very helpful to me is to have close relationships in my life where I can, number one, process out loud in a safe environment, my wife, with you, several other people, to kind of sort through a lot of my thoughts and
Yeah.
then have and feel my feelings and then let real wisdom start to leak in. I think that's one thing that's been very, very helpful. And then the other thing is just the fact of knowing that I'm not responsible to come up with the perfect reaction or the perfect response. It's okay for me personally to be silent. And it's okay, maybe not to be silent on something, but to say rather than reacting to this, we're actually going to look at Jesus and we are going to take into account similar situations and how he reacted and responded and say, it's not how I say we should do it. It's we've got a great example here. And the overall thing that I really hope our pastors hanging out with us today, I hope you take away is that fellowship and conversation and communion with other pastors and other leaders and other trusted people is really an asset. And more than an asset, I think it's a prerequisite before you make any decisions on how you want to react or respond to big cultural events.
Yeah, and having some diversity within that's important.
Well
There's
said.
a sociological phenomenon called false consensus effect. And every pastor knows this. This is when the person comes to you and says, I've been talking to a lot of people and they all think blah, blah, blah. And if you actually say, well, who? You find out it was like my wife and another person. But because you believe something, you assume everyone else agrees with you. And so that's important. Otherwise, you get in that echo chamber dynamic. And then I think we just have to give ourselves and our people permission to not have to have an opinion on everything. I remember after the war broke out in Ukraine, I saw somebody post, man, it's amazing how many of my friends not only are epidemiologists and health care experts, but they're actually foreign policy gurus also, and it's like, we're not. I mean, we got to kind of stay in our lane a little bit and go, God knows everything. I don't have to. And that doesn't mean that I just get aloof and don't care. But we talked about this in the political season episode, James 1, you should be slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to become angry. And that has to inform these things.
Thank you so much for hanging out with us, going through this episode of the Preaching Through podcast. Again, the whole reason why we do this is to give you the opportunity to step in and have a conversation about things that you are naturally going to encounter through the context, through the timeline of your ministry. Our hope is that you gain a little bit of insight and maybe just, I can think a little bit more about that. I've got a little bit more direction. And if you have enjoyed this episode, I really would love to invite you to head over to Apple Podcast or head over to Spotify and leave a review. Let us know that you're listening. Let us know how you've been helped. Let us know what you might want us to talk about in the future. Just give us a little bit of feedback on how you think we can continue to serve the local pastor and serve the local church so that they can be prepared to not only react appropriately to whatever may come down, but to proactively disciple and to proactively preach the word of God in 21st century America. Luke, it's a lot of fun. I am very grateful that both of us were on board to do this. I think the conversations they've been a lot of fun, albeit some are a little bit more serious than others, but I think there's this element of fun and just enjoyment knowing that we have other people to process through. So I appreciate you being able to do that. And we'll do it in more episodes. What do you say?
Sounds great.
All right. We'll see you guys next time.